You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. For as long as humans have been having sex, they've been looking for ways to enhance it, whether through new techniques, positions, or even substances that can change how we experience pleasure. But some of the most widely used sexual enhancers weren't designed for that purpose at all. They were discovered by accident. Take, for example, a drug that was originally developed to treat heart conditions, but eventually made its way into nightlife, becoming deeply embedded in queer culture, and is now widely associated with altering and enhancing sexual experiences. Even if you've heard of it, there's a good chance you don't know its surprising history. In today's episode, we're diving into a drug known as poppers. We're going to explore how it affects the body, why it became linked to intimacy and pleasure in the first place, some of the most common myths and misconceptions surrounding it, as well as why it remains such a controversial substance today. My guest is Adam Smith. He is a writer and multi-format producer. His books include Deep Sniff, A History of Poppers and Queer Futures, as well as Soulmates, A History of Our Fetish for Feet. He also writes theater shows and podcasts, including Press Play, Turn On, which won Podcast of the Year at the British Podcast Awards in 2024. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around, and we're going to jump in right after the break. If you've ever wondered why love feels so intoxicating, why desire can be so powerful, or why heartbreak can feel almost physically painful, there's a biological reason for it. In his new book, The Intimate Animal, Dr. Justin Garcia, the executive director of the Kinsey Institute, explores the hidden evolutionary forces that shape our sex lives, relationships, and emotional bonds. Drawing on cutting-edge research in biology, anthropology, and psychology, he makes the case that we are, at our core, intimate animals, wired for connection, attachment, and desire in ways that we're only beginning to fully understand. If you're fascinated by the science of sex and relationships and want a deeper look at why we love the way that we do, be sure to check out The Intimate Animal, available wherever books are sold. Okay, Adam, let's talk about poppers. And let's start with the basics because there's a lot of confusion here for some people. I'm sure some of my listeners are intimately acquainted with them. Others have this sort of vague association with the term in either sex or nightlife. And then some people have no idea what we're talking about. So how would you describe poppers? Can you walk us through what poppers are chemically and how people use them?
Yeah, poppers is a kind of slang name or street name for a chemical substance which has to be synthesized. People have to create it themselves by mixing other substances together. And the first substance that was discovered in that way is called amyl nitrite. So there are lots of other substances that basically have the same effect or similar effect, and they're all nitrites. They're all in the family nitrites. And it's a relatively easy thing to synthesize if you have the right equipment and the right substances. It is liquid at room temperature, but it's also always evaporating at room temperature. So the vapor is always lifting from that liquid. So it tends to be sold in little bottles, really, really, really small bottles, the kind of bottles that's like a caffeine shot that you might buy at the corner shop to give you energy. But don't get them confused because you absolutely should not drink poppers. And so they're sold in these little bottles in the sex shop or in the corner shop or online. It's a liquid. You want to open the cap and you basically inhale the rising vapor from that. And what it does is it lowers your blood pressure by dilating your blood vessels momentarily. It's an effect that only lasts about a minute or two. And your blood vessels dilate, which means your blood flows more easily through your body. So your muscles get very happy and relaxed because they're full of blood. And your brain gets very happy and relaxed because it's full of blood. And the overall effect is that you feel like a little bit high for a couple of minutes. And most people feel a little bit more horny as well for those couple of minutes. And because your muscles are relaxed, depending on the kind of sex that you might want to have, it can also help with that as well. Because if you're going to be penetrated in your bum or in your vagina, then it relaxes those muscles. And so it facilitates that, but also it feels nice too. So that's the kind of broad category.
Well, thanks for that thorough explanation. So it's an inhalant that promotes relaxation, provides a brief feeling of euphoria. And so, it sort of makes sense why many people might enjoy using that in a sexual context. But regarding the history of poppers, I think one of the interesting parts of the story is that it didn't actually begin as this recreational or sexual substance, right? It started out as a legit medical treatment. So can you tell us a little bit about the origins of poppers? What were they originally used for, and when did people start using them in a different way?
Yeah, I kind of think it's a little bit like the history of the internet, how like the internet was kind of invented so that physicists could communicate to each other over a network while they were doing their physics research. And then now the internet is just porn. And so it's kind of similar with poppers.
And cat pics too.
And cat pics, exactly. Yeah, it's kind of similar with poppers. Well, originally the first amyl nitrite as a substance was synthesized in 1849 by a French chemist who was the kind of scientist who was just mixing lots of different things together to see what happened. He created amyl nitrite and he noticed that it made him blush, but it didn't do really anything else. But he wrote about it and published it and then put it aside and didn't do anything with it really. He wrote about the effects of it making him blush. And then a few other scientists also experimented with it and wrote about their experiments. And they noticed that it was maybe dilating the blood vessels and having this effect. So then the most important thing happened in 1867. And a lot of people, by the way, wouldn't necessarily know that the history of poppers goes back to the 19th century. Like it's 150 years, it's a really long time. There's a doctor in Edinburgh, in Scotland, called Thomas Lauder Brunton, who was treating patients with angina. So they were having acute pain in their heart, which is really scary when it happens. It comes on all of a sudden, and it's because your heart isn't getting enough blood because the vessels that are leading to the heart are constricted. He knew that that's what was going on for those patients who were having angina pain. And he read about this substance which seemed to ease the flow of blood to the heart if it was inhaled. So he tried it out on patients and it worked. It really took the pain away for them because it eased the flow of blood to their heart. So he wrote about that and said, this is a good idea. Other doctors can give this to angina patients. They just put a few dabs of the liquid on a cloth and get the patient to inhale the vapor, and then the pain goes away momentarily. So he wrote about that, and that's really what amyl nitrite was for like several decades, was a medical intervention for people with angina. And this is also where poppers get their name from, why we call it poppers now, because that was the kind of era when poppers got their name. Should we talk about how poppers got their name, Justin?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I even know.
So, as I said, like the crucial thing is that it's a liquid, but it's vaporizing at room temperature. The liquid you don't want to get on your hands or your skin or anything because it's quite toxic and it's painful, but you do want the vapor. And so when it became a medical product that was manufactured, the manufacturers had to come up with a way of getting this liquid to people, being able to transport it, and also being available in like one-off doses where you could just use the vapor and not have the liquid on you. So they came up with this little glass ampule, which is like a tiny, 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 tiny glass bottle, essentially, which they would have the liquid in it. And if you held it in a handkerchief or something like that, you could crush the glass in your handkerchief, and then the vapor would rise out of it and you would get the hit from what you need. But the act of crushing that glass, which was pressurized, gave off a little pop sound. So that's how poppers got their name. That's how it became poppers, basically, was because still in the medical use. Mm-hmm. And then at some point in the early to mid 20th century, people started using it knowing, like they started to notice, probably people had noticed before, the patients had noticed before, that it also had these other effects, making them a little bit horny and a little bit euphoric. And so obviously people started doing that in sex. There's a theory, there's an idea, some gossip that maybe it was Harvard medical students in the 1930s that had access to it and were clearly trying to avoid writing their medical papers and just like fucking instead. Can I say fucking?
Oh yes, you can say whatever you want.
So I don't know, and I couldn't do any research on this, and it's a hard thing to research and it's hard to get funding for, but so I don't know exactly when it crossed over into recreation, but by the 50s and definitely into the 60s, people were buying them from pharmacies saying, I've got a heart problem, can I buy amyl? And the pharmacies were selling them to them, and then they were actually using them to have sex with or in the nightclub for pleasure. So that's set them on the path for where poppers are today.
But somewhere along the way, poppers became very strongly associated with gay male communities and queer nightlife. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of how they became embedded in that cultural context, and then like some of the broader significance and meaning it's had in terms of that community and implications for identity and resistance during different historical moments.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that I think I found things out in researching the book that I didn't really know about and didn't really expect. I knew that poppers was really heavily associated with gay male culture. And the theory is that because it relaxes your bum muscles, so it's easier to be penetrated by a penis, basically, especially, when if your like anal muscles are really tight. And so for some people, and for a long time, that's kind of what poppers represented, was like a way for you to have anal sex as a gay man, basically. Of course, that also works for different people with different bodies as well. But it just became something that was like really associated with gay anal sex. So I think that probably in that early to mid 20th century bit that I was talking about, where it crossed over into recreational, it would have been mostly men having sex with men that were doing it. But then the crucial thing happened in the 1970s in the USA, when enough gay men were doing it and buying it from pharmacies, that clever companies in the USA entrepreneurs set up and said, you know what, this is a product. We can make this as a product. Forget the medical reason, forget the pharmacies. We can make this as a product. We can give it a brand name. We can put sexy adverts with like sexy hunky guys in them in all the gay newspapers and in the gay bars, and people will buy this, and it's associated with that. So there's, at that point in the 70s, there's the start of this symbiotic relationship, I would say, between like making poppers as a kind of commercial product and the gay male culture at the time that was really growing in New York, San Francisco, and London, in the throes of gay liberation. And, more people being out and more people flocking to those cities to find other gay men, and also being basic in the sense of being very much spoken to by adverts of like sexy hunky guys with like throbbing bulges and asses saying like, if you buy this tiny bottle of poppers and sniff it, you will be like strong and virile and you'll be able to fuck all night, basically. So there's this kind of like celebration, conflagration, convergence of all these things happening around the same time.
Yeah, so there was a real embrace of poppers within the gay and queer community. And what you were saying there in terms of the gay community and marketing and so forth, that's where we had the emergence of all of these very iconic brands of poppers, things like Rush and so forth, that people in the community know very well, and inspired songs like Troye Sivan's Rush, which is basically, a song about poppers. And so there is this way in which poppers have become very deeply embedded within this particular community. But it's also interesting when you think about poppers through a historical lens, because there have also been times when it's been the subject of a moral panic, particularly during public health crises, especially those impacting the gay community. And, in fact, there was just one last year where the FDA undertook this big crackdown of a major poppers manufacturer. And the FDA is led by RFK Jr., who previously was somebody who was espousing this idea that using poppers causes AIDS. And it's like, that's not true. So I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about poppers and sort of the moral panics that have been associated with them over time as well.
In the mid-80s in the USA and the UK and other places, among the communities that were most acutely affected by this new virus that was really horrific, HIV, and that was killing people in really horrific ways, there was the understandable need for answers and for a villain. And so a lot of people were like scrabbling around trying to find the source of this virus, and also the ways that it was transmitted, and also the way that the transmission was being facilitated, right? That's why the bathhouses in San Francisco were closed down very quickly, because it was a place where lots of people, gay men, were having lots of sex. And they just closed the bathhouses down because they were like, that's causing this problem, or that's partly this problem. That was a mistake. And it's a kind of a classic example of a bad sex policy mistake, because what it meant is that people still did sex anyway, but then they were doing it in private, and you couldn't reach them with health messages like you would have been able to if they were in the bathhouse because you knew that they were there, and with condoms and things like that. But I understand why you want answers. You know, your friends are dying, you're sick, and you want answers. And so what a lot of people noticed was that lots of gay men were having sex and lots of gay men were getting HIV, and lots of those gay men who were having sex were using poppers. And it tended to be the more poppers you used, then the more promiscuous you were, and therefore the greater your chance of HIV. So some people said, therefore poppers cause HIV and poppers cause the transmission of HIV. And that is not true, but it was an idea that stuck, I think, because a lot of people want a clear answer and they want a clear villain. And so there were people from the gay community and beyond who were campaigning to say everyone needs to stop using poppers. It's causing the HIV epidemic and it's a big problem. And then as medicine and policy and activism got more and more sophisticated, that idea like was shown not to be true, and it's shown not to be right, actually, like kind of like morally right as an argument. So it kind of fell away, but then it's still there. And it came back again, as you said, like a couple of years ago with the US administration and FDA taking action and RFK saying those things and making that link again. And I think it's because, you know, people want to demonize sex that's just sex for pleasure. They want to demonize a substance that can help people have pleasure and that can help people have anal sex, actually. And they always want a villain, like they want a bad guy. And so that was why. And it's, you know, this poppers thing is like the fact that it's come back, the argument against poppers and the blame that poppers are having to bear for things like HIV, that's the same as like other attacks on other minorities. You know, right now in the UK and in the US, it's also trans people, especially trans women. And the arguments against them are very similar and connected to arguments made against trans people in the 80s and against gay people made in the 80s. So there's this cyclical nature to these things because politics and social attitudes, they want baddies and they pick people who are vulnerable and they pick substances, in this case, that help with pleasure, you know? So that's my long-winded answer to that.
Well, yeah. And, you know, what you're saying there about how we always need a villain reminds me a lot of how porn is being talked about these days politically and in the media as the cause of so many of our sexual problems. But it's like, if we actually gave people reasonable sex education, porn wouldn't become the default source of sex ed, and maybe they would actually know a thing or two about it. And so it's, yeah, there always needs to be a villain, but it's not always the right one. But anyway, that's a whole other separate podcast episode. But so poppers don't cause HIV, right? But there's a lot of mixed messaging out there about how safe or risky it is to use them. So what's your assessment of it? Like, what are the evidence-based risks that people should be aware of when it comes to poppers? And what are people getting right or wrong about that?
Yeah, so I should be cautious here because I'm not a researcher. I haven't done studies on safety. I've looked at things that are available online, but I also have to say that not just because I'm sort of just like one guy in a bedroom, like I'm an independent writer, you know, and maker. So I don't have access to lots of things, but not just because of that, but also because from what I can tell, like there's not been a lot of research on safety, on use. What I do know from what I have seen, and especially when you compare it with other drugs, basically, that of course there's not zero risk, there never is. And there are some specific people with certain kinds of bodies interact badly with poppers. Like, for example, it can lower your blood oxygen quite significantly. And if you have a certain kind of, it's not like a health condition or something necessarily, but if you just have the kind of body where that would put you at risk, it can be dangerous. And so some people, if they faint when they do it, basically, then that tells them that it's affecting them in a way that it doesn't affect other people. As far as I know, that's a relatively small number, like a small proportion of people. So that's one thing. The other thing is, in general, that like it's a relatively safe thing. First of all, the high doesn't tend to lead to you putting yourself at risk or in danger in a way that, you know, having a lot of alcohol, you can put yourself at risk or in danger and put other people at risk or danger. And similarly, doing other kinds of drugs, they can put you at risk or danger. So poppers tend to not do that. And it's also such a short-lived high. There have been some small studies, not really studies, but kind of observations that some doctors have made with certain kinds of substances of poppers, because there's like a family of substances, right? And there's one in particular, it's isopropyl nitrite, that doctors have observed that heavy use of that in one particular session, in a single session, can cause some vision problems, which then get restored. But there's, as far as I know, not done a lot of research on that. And it's been small observations, basically. So I definitely think there's room for more research there. But I also think there's something kind of broadly true, which is that people have been sniffing amyl nitrite and butyl nitrite and pentyl, which is the more newer one. They have been sniffing them for years and using them in sex, and on quite a big scale, actually, in the USA and the UK anyway, which is where I'm most familiar with, and some other European countries. I'm not saying that like it's out of the woods, but I do think that we would probably know by now if there was like something seriously wrong at the level of a population with the use of this substance. That said, there are new substances being developed and marketed all the time. So who knows where that might go.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where there are certain contraindications, like you're not supposed to use poppers if you're taking Viagra, because that can lead to a dangerous drop in blood pressure. There's some people who might have individual sensitivities to it. For some people, it can cause like a severe headache. So you always have to know and be aware of how a substance interacts with your own unique body. And, there might be a difference between very recreational, occasional use versus very intense, very heavy use of any given substance. So it's always good for people to be informed and make decisions that are right for them. But I think one of the biggest risks with poppers is when people just don't understand what it is and do things like, and I've seen like lots of media reports recently, and it's usually straight guys who are middle-aged or older. They're walking into a sex shop, they buy poppers, and then they chug it, thinking that it's like a 5-hour energy drink. And then they end up in the ER. And it's like, okay, that's like actually the biggest danger of poppers, is that you've got people who don't know what it is, who are drinking it instead of inhaling it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really well put. And the fact is that that's only a danger, not because of the substance itself, but because those people don't know. And why don't they know? Well, it's because poppers sit in this weird zone of law and policy where it's legal, but only because of certain kind of ways that it's described or not described. And so basically the makers and the manufacturers are coy about their existence, and they're coy about how you use it. And they kind of have to say, they kind of, for mostly in the USA and the UK, they can't say that it's for human consumption, even though that's exactly what they're selling it as, in the sense of consuming it to inhale, but they often call it leather cleaner or room odorizer or something like that, to say like, this is not for people to use. So I think that there's a kind of secret pact between government and policymakers and manufacturers and people marketing it, and all of us using it as well. There's a kind of secret pact that like, if you know, you know, and that's because it sits in this weird area of the law. And, the alternative would be poppers manufacturers having a go and saying to governments, like fully legalize us. And then we can describe on the product how you should use it safely, and this is what's happened with marijuana and other substances, about like know your limits and things like that. But poppers is something that they can't do that with. And I think a lot of them don't want to do that because it's risky. They'll bring more visibility to their business and they want it to be kind of on the down low. There's an interesting pact going on there. But also more broader than that is whatever the responsibility on the poppers manufacturers, it's one thing. But the other thing is just in terms of, like you've said earlier, just in good sex education, good drugs and substance education and knowledge. And it's interesting to me how poppers has for so long been such a big part of gay male culture and queer culture that like it's the kind of thing, the information about it, the education about it is the kind of thing that gets passed between people in an informal way because it's part of our culture. That's what we do. And we induct other people into it and we tell them, this is how you do this safely. Whereas other people just walking into a sex shop and buying it and they're not part of a culture or a sexual culture like that, it can be more dangerous. And so I guess this is a plea always for like more sex education, more substance education, and people talking more openly and freely about sex and pleasure and substances, and how to use them safely.
And I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a message we can all get behind. So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Adam. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new books?
Absolutely. So yeah, my website is adamsmith.com. It's Smith with a Z, Z-M-I-T-H, although I should say Z for the American listeners. So yeah, just adamsmith.com. And the Popper's book is called Deep Sniff. And the foot fetish book that I wrote is called Soulmates. Soulmates is actually, it was published in the UK, but it's actually coming out in the USA in the spring in May 2026. So I'm super excited about that now people can get it in bookshops in the USA as well. So all the foot freaks in the USA and just anyone who's interested in the history of feet fetishes can get it. I also just published a new book in the UK as well with a co-author, Tash Walker. That book's called The Logbooks. So we'll see how that one does. And then hopefully that might make it to the USA as well.
Well, great. I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks, Justin. It's been lovely to speak to you.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.